Preface of the City of God by Augustine of Hippo. Preface, explaining his design and undertaking this work. The glorious city of God is my theme in this work, which you, my dearest son, Marcellinus, suggested, and which is due to you by my promise. I have undertaken its defense against those who prefer their own gods to the founder of this city, a city surpassingly glorious, whether we view it as it still lives by faith in this fleeting course of time, and sojourns as a stranger in the midst of the ungodly, or as it shall dwell in the fixed stability of its eternal seat, which it now with patience waits for, expecting until righteousness shall return unto judgment, and it obtain, by virtue of its excellence, final victory and perfect peace. A great work, this, and an arduous, but God is my helper. For I am aware what ability is requisite to persuade the proud how great is the virtue of humility, which raises us not by a quite human arrogance, but by a divine grace above all earthly dignities that totter on this shifting scene. For the king and founder of the city of which we speak has in Scripture uttered to his people a dictum of the divine law in these words: God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. But this, which is God's prerogative, the inflated ambition of a proud spirit, also affects, and dearly loves that this be numbered among its attributes, to show pity to the humbled soul and crush the sons of pride. And therefore, as the plan of this work we have undertaken requires, and as occasion offers, we must also speak of the earthly city, which, though it be mistress of the nations, is itself ruled by its lust of rule. Let's begin by noting some key points about the words that I've underlined. First, when Augustine speaks of the glorious city of God, he refers to the Latin word civitas, not the Latin word urbs. The Latin word urbs refers to the built environment of a city, whereas civitas refers to the people, the assemblage of citizens, the community, the commonwealth. So he's talking about a group of people, a group of people. Next, this book is dedicated or addressed to my dearest son, Marcellinus. Now, this edition, in the edition of Philip Schaff in the Church Fathers, Philip Schaff has a note talking about how Marcellinus was a friend of Augustine, and he was a high-ranking official in the imperial government. And actually, if you go back to those letters, you can see evidence of the situation in which Augustine actually first promised to write the City of God to Marcellinus. Next, we come to this word, defense. So this is a work of apologetics. This word defense clues us in that this work, the City of God, has an apologetic intent and an apologetic purpose, defending the city of God, the people of God, against those who prefer their own gods to the true God, the founder of the city. Now, in this next section, Augustine goes on to describe this city of God. And he says that it is surpassingly glorious, whether we view it as it still lives by faith in this fleeting course of time, and sojourns as a stranger in the midst of the ungodly, or as it shall dwell in the fixed stability of its eternal seat, etc. So I'm going to add a couple of notes there. So the city of God presently lives by faith and sojourns as a stranger. So first, this phrase lives by faith. This is a biblical allusion to that famous sentence, that famous phrase from Habakkuk 2 verse 4. The just shall live by faith. The just shall live by faith. And this is quoted in numerous places in the Old Testament, perhaps most famously in Romans chapter 1. So if we look at Romans chapter 1, we read that it says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." So here, Augustine gestures to the reality of justification by faith, of living by faith in this present age. Now, the second thing he talks about the city of God in this present time is that it sojourns as a stranger. Now, this is even more interesting when we look at the Latin, because there's a contrast between civis, which is a citizen, and peregrinus, which is someone who sojourns as a stranger. It's not a citizen. So this points to the fact that the city of God in the present age is not a citizen of this world, but rather the city of God sojourns as a stranger in the midst of the ungodly. This speaks to the pilgrim identity of God's people in this present age. Let's move on to the second half of this twofold explanation and description of the city of God. "Or as it shall dwell in the fixed stability of its eternal seat, which it now with patience waits for, expecting until righteousness shall return unto judgment." So Augustine points out that there will come a day when the city of God will be consummated, when it will no longer be suffering the vicissitudes of time. It will no longer be living by faith. It will no longer be sojourning as a stranger. Right now, it's waiting for this final state with patience. Again, an allusion to Romans. I forget which chapter, but it's pointing us to Romans. And then here's an actual quote: "Expecting until righteousness shall return unto judgment." This is a quote from the Psalms. Augustine was a great student of the Psalms, a great lover of the Psalms. And this is a quote from perhaps what is for most of us, certainly it was for me, a lesser known psalm. And yet it is significant that Augustine quotes it here when he's trying to point us toward the goal of what we wait for as believers. This is from Psalm 94, and the translation is different. Justice, this is Psalm 94, verse 15. Justice will return to the righteous, and all the upright in heart will follow it. So that is what the city of God, the people of God, we as believers wait for. That day when justice returns to the righteous, and all the upright in heart will follow it. And then he goes on to say that the city of God will obtain final victory and perfect peace. A great work this, and an arduous, but God is my helper. Again, an allusion to the Psalms, Psalm 61, verse 9. Now let's go on to the second part of the preface. He speaks next about how great is the virtue of humility, contrasting this with pride. And there is a letter of Augustine's in which he was advising kind of discipling a younger Christian, and he talked about how for a public speaker, the three rules were delivery, delivery, and delivery. But for the Christian, the three lessons are humility, humility, and humility. And this is really interesting because here he indicates that part of what he's trying to do in this book, The City of God, is to persuade the proud about the greatness of the virtue of humility. How great is the virtue of humility? So that's part of what The City of God, this book by Augustine, is all about. And then he goes on to enforce this, to underscore how important a theme this is or how important this is to the Christian faith, by pointing us to a verse which is actually repeated in multiple places throughout the Scriptures. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. This verse is originally from Proverbs 3, verse 34, but is also quoted in James chapter 4 and 1 Peter chapter 5. And indeed, it seems to be one of Augustine's favorite verses, one which he quotes in the Confessions, one which he quotes also in his book on Christian doctrine. All right, to wrap this up, he says, but this, namely humility, which is God's prerogative, the inflated ambition of a proud spirit also affects. Now, this proud spirit could be taken as just a proud spirit in general, but it also has specific reference to the one who wrote this quote, namely Virgil. Virgil was the perhaps the greatest poet of the Romans. He was commissioned by the Emperor Caesar Augustus to write an epic poem that would tell the Romans about their greatness. And so this quote is from Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid, which is where the hero Aeneas goes to the underworld hundreds of years before the time of Virgil and Caesar Augustus, and purportedly sees a vision of the Roman greatness. And this is how Roman greatness was described: to show pity to the humbled soul and crush the sons of pride. And so Augustine's judgment and assessment of this is that, well, this is the inflated ambition of a proud spirit, Virgil being the proud spirit. So finally here, he mentions that we must speak also of the earthly city. Interesting to note that the earthly city is the contrast of the city of God, and so it's not the city of God versus the city of man, but it's the city of God versus the earthly city. And then finally, that though it be the mistress of the nations, is itself ruled by its lust of rule. And the wordplay here doesn't come through as well in the English as it does in the Latin, but he talks about how the earthly city is the master of the nations, enslaving them, but is itself enslaved by its lust of ruling others. This speaks to the power dynamic, which can cause so much destruction when those in power use their power proudly, when they use it without love for God and love for those whom they rule over. And yet it is also bad for the earthly city, because you can see the earthly city is itself ruled and enslaved by its lust of rule. So just a few things as we wrap up. First, there are some notes here by Philip Schaff which are quite helpful. He again points out the term civitas Dei, or polis theou, of the Church Universal as a commonwealth and community. He gives some scripture references there where we can see how this is a key biblical theme. He has a footnote here about Marcellinus, and then points us to some letters of Augustine, which were either to Marcellinus or about Marcellinus. And you can see here that some details about who Marcellinus was. Here's notes about the quote, righteousness shall return unto judgment, making note that Augustine was working from the Latin translation, which often differs and is not as precise as our English translations, which have a better knowledge of the Hebrew than Augustine had in his day. And then references for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And finally, there's the exact reference to Virgil's Aeneid. So just some concluding thoughts, applications. First, community is important. Augustine is concerned for the Christian community. Secondly, we see that this book arose out of a relationship, what we might call a discipling relationship. And so this is so important for authentic Christian living. Thirdly, he deals with the theme of idolatry. And so surely any student of Scripture is very aware of the grave and fundamental sin of idolatry, and so it is for Augustine as well. And next we see this theme of pilgrimage. So we are pilgrims. And Augustine's point here is distinct from John Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress, where he is talking about the journey of the individual Christian. For Augustine, he is looking at the journey of believers together as a community, as pilgrims in this world. Fifthly, with this verse from the Psalms, we see the concern for justice. Many in our time are concerned for justice, and rightfully so. God is just. And so the part of the last things include judgment. And so we as Christians ought to be concerned for justice and for God's justice to be done, for his will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that we would long for that day when the new heavens and the new earth come, as it says in 2 Corinthians 3, the new heavens and the new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness and justice. 6, we see his concern for humility, that this is a virtue of virtues. Indeed, he calls it, it's a great virtue, and it raises us above all earthly dignities. It raises us above all earthly dignities that totter on this shifting scene. And finally, we see, just in the last part, what we might call the theme of the stewardship of power. The stewardship of power. All of us, in various ways, in our callings, have been given power. How important it is that we remember that this is whatever power we have in our work or in society or in our families is not for us, but it is for the benefit of those whom we serve. So, what a rich preface, what a rich beginning to this great and arduous work, as St. Augustine calls it. And I hope it gives you a good taste of the wonderful treasures which lie in store as we continue to get glimpses of the city of God.